Alrighty. So today is a happy day and a sad day. So happy that the essay 3 is done. Sad because there's no more essays to do in this class. I know you'll miss writing sociological essays, but that's the benefit. You guys are just starting your learning journey here at U of T, so you have years of sociologizing to do. Sad also because we only have one more lecture left after this week. I was just in contact with Ujwal, Sarah, and Andrew. Again, Ujwal from SOS, students of sociology, and Sarah and Andrew. Of course, Sarah, is a peer mentor, and so is Andrew for this class. So they are going to be organizing, I believe, their drop-in Q&A sessions about study tips for the exam. So they'll be doing that. As promised, I have been putting together my course recap kind of compilation video. So that I've more been working on the script for that. So it won't be like as entertaining as some of the other ones, but it's going to be long and me kind of going over each chapter, what you should focus on, what you should get out of it. Because I think at this point that's more practical and more useful. But I probably will still make a few more funny ones. So this week we have globalization. Next week we have extending this into environmentalism, which we'll be discussing a little bit this week in terms of the impact of technology on the environment. So again, thank you to those of you who submitted your essays to the Undergraduate Research Day program. It was competitive, so those of you that were accepted, I tried to get more slots, but I only got 3 slots. So those of you that were selected, you will be emailed by one of the sociology professors that are organizing the event. So for everyone here, if you, they didn't put the day, so that's not great, on their special thing. So I could show you. So on the PowerPoint slide, if you want to RSVP, you have to click, you have to have it in PowerPoint mode, otherwise it doesn't work. So if you have it in presentation, you can click here, and then it will open up the RSVP. So you'll see that and I'll make another announcement since I didn't realize the date wasn't there. So Tuesday, April 9th, so it's just after all your lectures are done. So if you're having academic withdrawal, and you're thinking I'm using the social withdrawal, the aging theory, withdrawal theory, and I'm withdrawing from society, but it's making me really sad, and I need to see I need this nerd energy again. Then you can come to Undergraduate Research Day and see what your peers are doing. Remember, you need active, healthy aging, healthy learning, not withdrawal. So you want to be part of this. So it's a lot of fun. I'm going to be there. So if you miss me, you can come there. I'm one of the judges, so you can see me pass judgment, yay, nay, on people's papers. That's not sociology. That's good. That's exactly what I'm going to be like. So, or will I? Maybe I'll be different. Maybe I'll be wearing a hat. Maybe, who knows? So anyway, so that's something fun to do, and something, just to get yourself revved up to write awesome papers as the years progress. So you can be a star at Undergraduate Research Day. That's what they call it, Okay, so again, without further ado, we have our Globalization Week. So, as per usual, we'll start with some definitions. First of all, thanks to everyone for coming today. I know that the essay was due right now, so I expected attendance to be a bit lower. I also know that you're probably a bit tired out from writing the essays, so today will be a bit lighter. Also, as you've seen, the Test 2 grades were released last week, and as I had thought, the class average was a few percentage points higher than Test 1, about high 60s. The distribution, A's, B's, C's, and so on, were roughly the same. So if you want to see your test, I'm still waiting on Howson's tests to come in, so before I can do a viewing, I need all of them together. But I will likely post, that's why I haven't posted the date yet, because I thought I'd have the tests. But I'll likely have extended office hours on Monday of next week. so that you can come and see them. So again, I'll let you know, but I should have his tests by then. I have everyone else's. So once I have everyone's, I can put them together, and then we can have our little viewing party. And again, good job. The trajectory of this class so far has been a nice kind of steady improvement. So if you didn't do how you wanted, remember it's the tortoise that wins the race, not the hare. You don't want to jump and do so well and then think I don't need to study anymore. I got this university thing down. It's okay. As I said, I didn't do very well in the first semester of my first year of university, and it was more gradual for me. So if you're in that position, try not to be too upset by it, and just think, okay, how can I learn from this experience to try to improve on the long term? Because you have a whole bunch of courses left, a whole lot of learning to do. It does not end with Sociology 03. Okay, so globalization. So we've implicitly talked about globalization throughout this whole course. When I discussed the founding of modern sociology as we know it now, looking at the Industrial Revolution, we were very, very much focused on this shift from what I called, previous modes of economic production, previous ways of life. Primarily, we were focused on what I called feudalism, or that kind of pre-industrial time when the majority of people lived on self-subsisting farms, and then how that, through the division of labor, resulted in the production of what were called manufactories, so factories that were focused on the manufacturing of goods, and then into full-out factories and into the split between rural areas, what once were full of those self-subsisting farms, now having bigger farms, and then everyone else, most of those people living in cities, living in industry, and all the good and bad that came out of that process. So globalization is another product that U of T is very involved in as well, due to how many international students we have, how many different programs we have, how much of a kind of how many people go to U of T then work around the world, and vice versa, how many of our professors are from around the world. So globalization is a more recent or contemporary outcome of this broader process or shift. So globalization describes essentially the worldwide exchange of economic goods, resources, services, so things around money. So again, you can even think of websites like Amazon and eBay where you can buy and sell things all around the world. You can think of countries that have trade relationships with one another. So right now, America, it's always kind of in the spotlight in the contemporary West, but America's really in the spotlight right now because of what Trump wants to do with certain trade relations with other countries. So, whether he wants to, if he wants to cut off trade with, say, China, that's a question of globalization. Someone putting forth that policy or curbing a policy on trade is showing assumptions about the pros and cons of globalization. So they're asking, is it good that we buy a lot of stuff from another country, or should we create these things ourselves? These were questions that were asked by political and economic leaders hundreds of years ago and continue to be asked. So globalization, again, is a big hot button issue. We live in a globalized world, again, meaning we can buy and sell things all around the world. We can travel very freely. Different cultures and societies, of course, have different norms and values and customs and laws, but we are becoming increasingly interconnected. So again, on two levels, both trade, so economic stuff, but also more social. So again, remember in our media week, one of the potential criticisms of the mass media was that different cultures and different societies are becoming increasingly alike. And again, it's nice when things become similar, but is there any power imbalance going on? So, the question was, to what extent are cultures becoming similar because they're all kind of being dominated by countries like America and Canada, or to what extent are they becoming similar in more of like a community way? So are cultures really kind of neutrally becoming similar, or are some countries kind of taking the lead and potentially even exploiting other countries? So this week takes on those questions when we get to things like modernization theory and dependency theory and world systems theory, of basically trying to see, okay, we have all these theories about how different cultures, different societies, different economies operate. Globalization is going one step more like meta, higher up, and saying, okay, now how do we look at all these different societies together? So again, this is kind of a process week. It's a slightly more theoretical, broader week than some of the others, and you can apply it to every other substantive topic. Again, that's what's so cool about sociology. We switch between learning about empirical topics and then processes. So for example, we can study how globalization has impacted gender norms in different countries. We can study how it impacts like the process of racialization. Does the salience of having light skin or dark skin, does that matter in different countries? Income inequality. Any topic you think of that, say, you're interested in studying in Toronto, applying globalization you'd then be asking, how is this process impacted by immigration, by technological developments that allow trade, all those sorts of things. So you'll see here what exactly some of the outcomes of globalization are, and again, how they can be seen as positive or negative, depending on the theoretical approach you take. So here it says it's responsible for severing social relations based on geographic location due to increasing flows of people, images, and information. So very much like in the media week, that's a big way of saying globalization reduces the salience of geography. So again, things like TV and movies that we learned last week, newspapers, the internet, all of these things, remember we said they're space biased, right? They're meant to travel as far as they can. So that nicely builds up to what this is saying about globalization. Basically, we're reducing barriers across places. Now the word severing is important because, the question will be anchored kind of around today is to what extent does the reducing of barriers across countries, the reducing of difference, to what extent is that a good or neutral thing versus what kind of negative impacts can that have? And we'll see the central kind of dichotomy of this week. We'll be looking at what's called the global north. So essentially Western countries plus countries like Japan that are economically well off versus the global south, countries that have traditionally been more exploited by the process of globalization. So again, like any other week, but this one in particular, it is a hot button issue and people are assessing it from both sides. So we'll be very much trying to engage with both. So the goal, like everything I'm teaching you in this class, history obviously goes beyond 500 or 600 years ago, but the birth of sociology is modern and really started in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries with the Enlightenment and the discussion of various thinkers who were focused on individual liberty and looking at how people form social contracts with states and engage in social reproduction and all of that. So the origins of globalization, again, remember, just imagine, we went through when we discussed Tyler and his, stages of society, and Comte and his stages of society. Remember the kind of crude image I gave you before was societies starting out very small scale and nomadic, wandering around, then settling, then building agriculture or pastoralism, and then agriculture, and then industry, and now post-industry. So the globalization is seen as starting with the agricultural revolution usually, and technologies becoming more advanced, people settling, and then people having to think, okay, what are our borders, who are our friends versus our foes, that sorts of things. So obviously there's always been connection between states, but the idea of really becoming global, it's existed for several hundred years, but really took off. It started to take off in the 16th century, and then, of course, majorly took off in that time period I always talk about of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, when telecommunications and internet technologies started booming. And it's just accelerating at a rapid pace now. Again, immigration rates and everything peaking around the world. So I'm just hearing some talking from a few groups around the class. Sorry, in the back. Hi. Okay. So in the 16th century, again, economic systems based on rational economic principles. Remember Weber and the rationalization thesis and bureaucracy, the idea being that societies will grow much more quickly once they have these shared logics on production and exchange. So this process of building a market, once a society becomes more sophisticated technologically, the consumer demands tend to go up as well. Now, what globalization in its first kind of iteration looks like is, again, think of members of a society. So think of Canada, think of Toronto. You have certain kinds of goods that can be produced, but there's certain goods you want. You see other goods in other cultures. Let's just make a fake example here, although of course most of the things we buy are not produced here. But let's say, we have iPhones only. Let's say there's no Android phones. But you see in movies that a bunch of people have Android phones and those look kind of cool. So then Canada or Canadian business manufacturers are in the position of asking themselves, okay, people seem to want Android phones. Should we produce them ourselves here in Canada? Or should we get these quote-unquote exotic goods, exotic meaning they're like not in our culture, they're from somewhere else at this point. Should we create them ourselves? What will the cost be for that? Or should we get them from somewhere else? Now that example seems a bit silly because you could make it here. The first kinds of global trades were more around goods that were quote-unquote indigenous to other areas. So certain fruits, certain vegetables, certain kinds of furs, fabrics. Basically, people in power or merchants would say, okay, there's a demand for this sort of good that someone's seen somewhere, maybe diamonds, gold, whatever it is, and so we want to bring it into the country as opposed to creating it here. Either because creating it's very expensive, we don't have the infrastructure, or it simply doesn't exist here, it's a natural resource that we don't have, a kind of oil, a kind of gem, something like that. So the origins, so part of why globalization has this double story, again, as being, as we'll see with dependency theory, and modernization theory mostly, but the positive, the more kind of functionalist story of globalization is that globalization is the natural outgrowth of certain societies becoming very technologically robust, and others trying to keep pace. That's the positive side. But, as we'll see, globalization, its history is very linked with colonization. So because of the fact that many countries were kind of forced into a Western mode of economic and social development, remember things we talked about like in Canada, residential schools, the Anglophone versus Francophone relations across Canada, the Quiet Revolution, Quebec wanting to separate, all of these issues will complicate the story. And again, we'll have globalization in the kind of happy or more economic sense of people being connected around the world, sharing modes of production, but then the side of globalization that's more about exploitation and winners versus losers. So again, this winners and losers framed around, again, wars and battles. So globalization again has these two meanings. So that's kind of the brief history. Again, I've given you so much history in this class, a lot of this would be redundant, so just kind of overlay this process of globalization on the other histories I've given you. Think again, throughout these intellectual and physical battles people were in, that one of the central issues, again, was this question of borders, this question of production. So globalization today, just 3 bullets on kind of what the impacts are and where things are going. So number 1, economies are increasingly interdependent and integrated. That should ring some bells and make things seem interesting. Is there any theorist in the class or social thinker we've read so far that kind of uses those words and that terminology? What does that make you think of? Interconnected and integrated. Yep. Maybe, but not the one I'm yeah. So who specifically? There's one person who always talks about it. Durkheim, right? So isn't that interesting? So he's saying, so remember, when we think of Durkheim, we usually think of someone talking about one society, right? Durkheim usually talks about a group, a society. But here, the thing with globalization is saying, you know, remember I gave in my little speech of Marx and Weber versus Durkheim or whatever, and I said, you know, Durkheim said he's just a lung of a larger whole. So here it would be like Canada's a lung, America's a kidney, and so on and so forth. Like the whole world is one body, and every country is an organ. So globalization, as we'll see today, the big question is, you know, to what extent are all of the countries connected? Think of things like the European Union, right? So, and Britain not wanting to be part of that and all the issues there. But so globalization is the tendency for separate societies to all become one society, or at least become more connected. And that's really, again, the big hot button issue of, again, if you have all of these different societies with different values, different histories, some people will resist the integration. They'll see it as forced. That's what the Britain-EU issue was, whereas others won't. The Quiet Revolution, again, Quebec wanting to leave Canada, these are divisive issues. Advance in communication technologies. So that's why I said kind of that period of the 1950s, although of course starting earlier than that with telecommunication more broadly. The key thing that would prevent globalization, if you try to think of it, you know, 500 years ago, is that you couldn't get around the world very quickly. If you could, it would be through some, you know, from our standards today, some grueling journey. Now you can talk instantly, or Facebook message or Skype instantly around the world. So that then furthers the process of saying, you know, we're separated by geography, but we're not really that separated. We can work together. You know, most of the work we do is knowledge-based now, so think of academia. Why can't you just have professors from, say, Australia or New Guinea or something? Why can't you have professors there that Skype in and do web option lectures here? Those are actual questions people are asking in the academy, for example, of having professors all around the world. And then lastly, so again, those are two kind of positives, but the central negative that people discuss when discussing globalization and why some people are resistant is this idea that it creates vast divides between the rich and poor. So this is very related to strain theory, which we discussed earlier, Robert Merton. Remember the key idea of strain theory, focused on America, is that kind of everyone values the same goals, but people have different opportunities to actually achieve those goals. So globalization, what it can do is, let's say everyone around the world wants to have iPhones and watch Netflix and whatever. They want to do these certain kind of Western luxury things. Different countries with different economic histories, as we'll see, have much lower average incomes. They may have all sorts of infrastructures that need to be developed, healthcare, and things like that. So what globalization does is it really amplifies the relative income inequality around the world. And it can actually feed that process more by shifting attention away from the inequality that exists and kind of onto the idea that we're all connected and more similar. So again, globalization, a very important topic to study because it is a process that's happening right now, and U of T, again, is a school or an institution with a very diverse student body. Toronto itself is very diverse, so it's very relevant, I think, to kind of end the course with this kind of topic. So global stratification. So the world, as it becomes more globalized, also is becoming increasingly defined around wealth and poverty. So again, wealth, when we were looking at socioeconomic status, wealth in this case, when you're looking at the macro country level, you can measure wealth in lots of different ways, but it's often measured around what we'll see the national gross domestic product. So the gross domestic product is the total amount of everyone's economic activity in that country. So basically, it's a barometer that's saying, you know, how much money is being made in this country on like a standardized scale. So you're using American currency and you're saying, okay, is $5 trillion produced in this country, or 5 billion or 5 million or whatever. So as we'll see, countries are arranged in a hierarchy based on how much economic activity they have. So based on this idea of creating money, so having companies like Facebook, where the average income is close to $300,000 US, versus, sweatshops, where the average income could be $1,000 US or less. That's a way of again, comparing wealth across countries. And poverty, as we'll see, can be absolute, having no money to buy food or not enough money to buy food and shelter, or relative, having some people that are suffering a great bit, but others that aren't. So we'll see too, before we get to the global north and global south, which I mentioned before, terms that traditionally have been used in Canada anyway, and the States, are the first world, second world, and third world. So for those of you that have heard the term, if you put up does anyone know, you don't have to say what it is, but just show of hands if you know the term first world problems. Okay, so people still say that. So the first world is countries like Canada, America, Japan, South Korea, Britain, countries where they make over a certain amount of gross domestic product every year. So here, the stereotype of first world countries and the name, so part why we switched to global north and global south, and like in academia and policy, from first world, second world, and third world to global north and global south, is that this implies that there's a hierarchy, that countries that are in the quote-unquote first world are better than those in the second and third world, as we'll see with the modernization thesis, because these countries are more secular, more industrious, more civilized, and so on and so forth. So we moved away from this definition, but it's important just to see the history of this before we get to the global north and south. So the first world, again, the terms came from the idea that these countries are the best. Everyone wants to live in the first world, and it's better than the second and third world for these other reasons. So second world countries, these are often countries like Russia and other countries of that whole area, countries that were part of the former Soviet Union. So second world countries, they usually are countries that have command economies. So these are countries that often had some sort of big institutionalized socialism in their leadership. So again, socialism here in the sense of having high state management. So it could be either oligarchic or socialist or communist. Again, those societies, communist and socialist, don't necessarily have to lead to a country becoming second world, but traditionally they have, because it's kind of hurt their economic production. And then second world isn't discussed quite as much. Usually it was first world and third world. The third world are seen as underdeveloped or underdeveloping, and the term third world has a very negative connotation because it implies that these societies have very little quote-unquote economic talent, or a very small usable workforce or industry. And so the country that I'm from, I think now people consider it second world if they use this term. Well, my dad's from Trinidad. Trinidad kind of alters in line between being seen as second world and third world, depending on who you talk to. But for the reasons that it has great wealth inequality within it, and there are many people living in absolute poverty. Whereas, as we'll see in Canada, there are far few people living in absolute poverty, but relative poverty. So academics and policymakers have shifted from these terms because they are judgmental and a little bit too rigid in their terms. They've shifted now to the global north and global south. So this captures a broader story, but it also allows to capture individual nuances more clearly. The central difference, I would say, is that looking at the global north versus the global south really privileges or focuses in on one process. So does anyone have any ideas of what that one process I'm thinking of is? Okay, well, so this division is very much based on colonial theory or post-colonialism. So the work of Edward Said. Remember, we read about Orientalism and imperialism, colonialism. So the global north and the global south, basically, the distinction remains on which countries, there's a Freudian slip, which countries historically have tended towards being more colonial and which ones have tended towards being colonized. Of course, there's intermixing and things get more complicated, but if you look at the countries represented here, so the global south, many of the countries that have been colonized, both by similar countries and by Western countries, many parts of Asia, South America, and Africa. The global south tend to be poorer in terms of the money that they generate, their infrastructures in terms of what we would consider Western technologies. They tend to be much more sparse. Their health care is often more fragmented. They have higher infant mortality rates, higher rates of female pregnancy, lower rates of female contraceptive use. A lot of the barometers we use for health and well-being here are lower in those countries. Rather than see them as necessarily being quote-unquote underdeveloped or inferior in some way, the shift here in looking at it as a global south is seeing globally there's a series of countries, in many cases due to colonization, that have, as an outcome of this process, had their infrastructures weakened and been kind of put in a race with these relatively privileged countries. So the key thing here is many of them are newly industrialized countries, what are called NICs. So again, they're kind of put into a race with countries in the global north, but they're put in this race at a severe disadvantage. So the global north, by contrast, countries like those in Western Europe, Canada, the US, Australia, Japan, these tend to be democratic, and the key is that they've had longer histories of being technologically advanced. So if you look at many of the high-tech innovations, car companies, think of Volvo in Germany, think of all the Japanese and American auto companies, then think of computer companies, video games, software. You see the same sorts of countries of origin over and over. So these countries, Canada included, have had a history of high education, high technology, and this in turn gives these countries a huge kind of advantage globally versus countries that have adopted these technologies more recently. So access to education, quality healthcare, clean water, and having voting rights, things like women's rights in the public sphere tend to be higher on average. All of these sorts of what you'd imagine, quote unquote, liberal, political, the things that people in the Liberal Party fight for, these things tend to be higher in these countries. So global north versus global south, again, it says the distinctions between countries around their income and their well-being and wealth is important, but rather than categorizing them hierarchically, saying, okay, which countries tend to have these factors and which don't, and which specific processes are responsible for this, and what can we do? So the three factors that tend to be, that contribute to globalization, and again, this mixing of values, cross-pollination, or even co-optation, kind of commanding the values of other countries, again, are technological change, political change, and economic change. So as we've discussed some of these so far. So technological change, of course, we've already been discussing that. Telecommunications started this, again, being able to phone people around the world. This spiraled into internet communication, video chat, live conferencing, emailing information, all of these, and airplanes, all of these different forms of technology, both travel and communication-wise, these massively accelerate globalization. So we can expect, again, that countries will reduce their barriers over time. Political change, I gave an example of that. So the reason why many countries were seen as part of the quote-unquote second world, many of them were in the former Soviet Union. So again, when a government kind of collapses, people in those countries, necessarily, many of them will want to leave. So you see this, there are many people in different parts of China that wanted to leave China due to the way government battles were going on. In Trinidad right now, there are many people fleeing Venezuela, Syrian refugees coming into Canada. So political changes tend to increase globalization through refugees and immigration. Again, think of America right now with the whole idea of building a wall. It's that's certain individuals thinking this process is not good for the country of America versus others who very much critique that, saying no, as a member of the global north, as kind of the key member, we should take more responsibility and be more embracing of people that want to come in. Yeah.
So the term development or developed, I think it sounds like really focused on like technological change and like everything that's on the slide, but I wanted to know about the nation-state relationship. I wasn't like exactly sure what the definition of like, or the differences between state and the nation is, because like, for example, in Canada, we have an Indigenous community, right? And they are very different in terms of like the political vision, like what's considered developed, for example, like living in like kind of like equilibrium between that nature and like the human and the spirits. They value that more. So I wanted to know the difference between state, nation.
Well, so that's a great question. So state and nation, so the question is, what's the difference between state and nation? So they often are used interchangeably, so you'll see the kind of hyphenated word of nation state. So in terms of definition, nation is really like an imagined community both of them are based around laws. But so this is not a formal definition, it's very, very murky. But what I would say, the key difference is, so if you think of Canada as a nation, you'd be thinking about it more in cultural terms. So what is it? Like and cultural and some practical terms. So Canada as a nation, what's its national history? What's its national anthem? What kind of production does it have? What's its demography like? Race, class, gender, that sort of stuff. If you look at Canada more as a state, that's implying that you're more interested in looking at it politically. So maybe even what wars has it been involved in? Is it democratic? So the state, so again, the nation state is again this imagined community of people around laws and norms and customs that share a state. So here it's like leadership by prime minister, and we have a parliamentary structure and democratic. So the nation state is this imagined community that then has a state. So that makes sense when you think of stateless societies. So they have stateless societies, and those aren't nations. So that's, I don't know if that makes sense, but it's more when you're thinking of the state, it's more the political and parliamentary structures and things like that. And then the nation, I think it's kind of the overall mass of what it is. Yeah. But there's no total defining line between them. They're often used, again, interchangeably. I think it's more an issue of emphasis. So again, political change, when there are huge economic catastrophes and revolutions, if you look again at the history of social movements, we didn't cover this that much last week, even though we talked about social movements, but one of the big outcomes of these sort of political uprises and upheavals is that people are often fighting for more power of the people, so for more democratic rights. So again, when you look at things like women's suffrage around the world, in various countries and various time periods, you have women resisting state laws and national norms, so just to use those terms, so state laws and national norms about gendered conduct. The spread of capitalism also increases too, because Even Karl Marx, who thinks things are tending towards communism, remember what he said about capitalism, the one huge benefit that it had, and how it was pushing people towards this kind of this sort of inevitable state of communism, of shared ownership, was that capitalists revealed that feudal lords and kings and queens and all these people, they had developed this caste structure. And bourgeois individuals, they were just people who, through industry, came to have ownership of private property. They created wealth. So he thought that revealed kind of the socially constructed nature of class difference. And so capitalism tends to increase again after political upheavals, because even though in capitalism there is a ton of inequality, in capitalism, one of the central kind of tenets is that anyone can make money, that ascribed characteristics don't matter as much. It's more about achieved characteristics, so getting an education versus, being born a lord or something. So capitalism and democracy, again, tend to increase when you look at globalization. And again, that's, if you're going to have global trade and people traveling around the world, we need shared currency structures and shared values around money, exchanges and all of that. So again, capitalism and democracy tend to increase as well. And then just building on that, of course, economic change. We see things like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, and transnational organizations. So something, a kind of elephant in the room, companies like Coca-Cola, like McDonald's, these are companies that transcend global boundaries. They may have originated in America. Again, I'm using those as specific examples of kind of America's dominance in this process. But even though they originated in one country, people from all around the world enjoy them, critique them, use them to some extent. The price of a big, I don't know if anyone, a show of hands if anyone has heard of the Big Mac Index. So the Big Mac Index is actually, so the price, so think of this, anytime you travel anywhere, the price of a Big Mac is often used as a kind of measure of a society's wealth. So basically, the more expensive the Big Mac is, the richer the country is, kind of thing. So it's actually proven to be fairly accurate. The more expensive it is, it's like there's like a proportion of the cost that it is and what the average income and GDP of the country are. Which makes sense, because if you had like a really expensive Big Mac in a poorer country, no one would buy it, except for the bourgeois Big Mac. The bigwigs eating the Big Macs. Okay. So let me see, just for how many slides I have. I think, okay. All right, so we're getting there. So I'll do these 3 slides and then we'll have our break. So globalization, then we're exactly halfway. Again, today I tried to make it a bit lighter, only one study buddy activity, but just for sake of time. There was also supposed to be a presentation in the beginning, but the person who was supposed to come is sick. So poverty. So very important, when we discuss poverty in sociology, we look at it in terms of its absolute and its relative qualities. So we cannot define poverty as simply those who do not have enough money. And the reason for this is that there's conflicting opinions on enough. So that's what these 2 definitions cover. So when you think of someone that's poor or someone that's suffering poverty, there's usually one of these 2 assumptions that you're making. And again, it's not bad or good that you're making these assumptions, but it's just an inherent logical assumption you're making. So assumption A, when someone uses the word poverty, so this family suffering from poverty, they are likely using, or a homeless individual, they're likely using absolute poverty implicitly as their definition. So this is that the person cannot meet the basic needs of life. And so that varies on the society that you're in, exactly what the content of those things are. But in general, around the world, that would mean you cannot get clean water. That should say food, not good. So you cannot, not enough food, clean water, or shelter. So this is someone who you're very scared that their life will end soon because they'll starve or they'll get very sick. And that's calculated in a simple way across societies. So like using the Big Mac index, it's calculated based on what the cost of buying a minimum diet of essential foods and the fuel needed to prepare it is. So this is someone that even if they were living in a shelter, say, or if it's a warm climate and they're living in like a makeshift shanty or house, they can't live because they can't even buy the cheapest food or prepare the cheapest food. Now, relative poverty is usually more, particularly in the West, what people mean when they say poverty. So relative poverty is the inability to secure goods and services required to live a life not of like glamour or extravagance or anything, but of like a basic, what someone might call lower class, working class life. So someone earning minimum wage, someone earning just enough to get by. So relative poverty is someone who can barely do that, or is struggling to get to that level. So they can survive, but they can barely pay their rent. They're living hand to mouth, paycheck to paycheck. That's all the terms people use. So those people are suffering relative poverty. They're making less than what you would expect someone working would make and are very much struggling. So again, it's not minimizing those people's experience, but it's saying usually when we discuss poverty, we're not discussing the actual initial definition of the term, which is absolute poverty, meaning you're going to die. Relative poverty is saying you're not living the life that, say, the Canadian image of life is. You can't get there. You're struggling for whatever reason. And so trickle-down theory is that because of poverty kind of seeing it in a graph as the poor as being at the bottom of the social hierarchy, this feeds out of functionalist, more economic conservative views. Trickle-down theory says, you know what? Maybe we don't need to help the poor very much, but instead of helping people that are relatively or absolutely poor, if we focus on stimulating economic growth, the money that's made in the nation, that GDP, will just trickle down to the people that are poor. So when you hear people saying, oh, create more jobs, add more industry, rather than create programs or job services for those suffering from poverty, often that's the theory they're using. So again, that's why it's very important to see how you're defining poverty, because the way you define it often leads to the theories you endorse about how to address it. We'll get to that more in the second half. But again, trickle-down theory is usually related to, again, political and economic conservatism are different, just like liberalism. Political means, or social conservatism is more, if you're against gender equality and things like that. Economic conservatism is that you very much think you shouldn't be giving a lot of money to welfare services and social programs and things, and that you should just be focused on infrastructure. So you don't need to know all of these numbers or anything. I'm just trying to give you a picture of this, and this is in the textbook anyway. So the key numbers here, undernourishment around the world, 1992, roughly 1990 to 2016. So the big numbers here to see is, so in 2014 to 2016, in developed regions, less than 5% of people report as undernourished, whereas in developing regions, it is 13%. And then another startling number is in Africa, it's 20%. So here you can see, so the other important number there is the world. So you see the world undernourishment rate is 11%. So developed regions are less than half of that, and developing regions are significantly more than that, and Africa's double that. So again, just thinking in terms of where countries are sitting, in terms of here, absolute poverty, so someone that's undernourished, it's speaking more to absolute poverty than relative poverty. And here it's fitting that same story. And if you look at some of these countries, the stereotype of people starving in Africa that you'd see in the 90s and 2000s on infomercials like UNICEF, many of those are accurate when you're looking at certain countries, but not all of them, as you'll see. So for example, you can look at Southern Africa, where it's only 5%, but Middle Africa with a 41% undernourishment rate. And again, you can think of that South Africa colonized and a huge white population versus Middle Africa that was more exploited by that process. I mean, both were, but the South Africa still has a big white population. So this is just a chart that, again, I would focus just on the big story, and looking through the list, sociologically ask yourself, why do these countries vary in terms of these undernourishment rates? What histories are similar or different? And again, just here, the story I think that's clearest is colonialism, and just seeing which countries have been more on the receiving end versus which ones were more active, involved in doing it. So just a little question, just to make sure we're getting everything. So true or false? So who thinks it's true? So relative poverty refers to not having enough money to meet the basic needs of life. Who thinks that's true? Okay, who thinks it's false? Good. What would that be the definition of? Absolute poverty. Okay, good. So you're listening. Okay. So we will come back in 5 minutes. Or sorry, 10 minutes, and then we will do globalization and inequality. If you have any questions, I'm up here. And again, we should be finishing on time today. And I'll have a question later. I'm going to make my little Mentimeter question and ask you all what kind of special thing you'd like next week. Because as you know, all the good students that have been coming all year, you know I had my narcissistic holiday lottery game in December, and so I'm going to do something next week. So I'm not totally sure yet. So it'll be a study session, partly. That'll be the normal part. But I'm thinking of how to jazz it up and make something fun. Oops. All right. So I just got fantastic news from our man Ujwal at SOS. So I will post the dates, but backed by popular demand, so just like the test 2 review session, we're going to have 3 3-hour-long review sessions, so on separate dates. So I will email it to you, but it is going to be this Wednesday from 2 to 5, and then Monday 11 to 2, and then next Wednesday 2 to 5 in HL 459. So HL 459, Wednesday 2 to 5, Monday 11 to 2, next Wednesday 2 to 5. And so it'll be going over everything in the course, and as I'm going to be doing my own review session next week at the end of class also, just letting you know again that the test is more heavily weighted on stuff that came after test 2, but that because it's a final exam, everything is fair game. So it'll be roughly like 2 or 3 questions from each chapter, and then 4 or 5 questions from the ones that we haven't covered yet. So focus more on the things we haven't covered, but do remember key things from the early chapters. So again, I'm trying to be more transparent with this final exam, both because I know you guys wanted more study guides, so I'm doing that with my YouTube video and my own presentation, and the little, whatever the activity is that I do next week. Yeah, so it's going to be more structured in that way, just to be clear, but also we do have a ton of content. I know this is a full year course, and so it's unique in that way that we have twice the content of other classes, so that's why I'm really more heavily weighing the recent stuff as opposed to everything. But there's no tricks with the older material. It's going to be, you know, big concepts that we've covered, like sex and gender, racialization, conflict theory, functionalism, symbolic interactionism. It's not going to be little tiny concepts that I briefly talked about in like lecture 4. I'm really not trying to do that. It's when I told students in my office hours today when they're asking me how to study, you know, think of those earlier weeks and look at the slides and try to quiz yourself just by saying, okay, what are like the 5 big concepts of this week? Or how does a sociologist think about gender? How do they think about racialization? Again, it won't be tiny concepts from those weeks. But I'll discuss that more next week, and the review sessions will do that. So again, I'll post those online just to make sure I got the dates right. But again, Wednesday 2 to 5, Monday 11 to 2, and Wednesday 2 to 5 next week in HL 459. Okay, so globalization and inequality. So the second half of this won't be super long because much of this I've already discussed. But so one of the biggest issues when studying globalization, again, there's this double-edged aspect of it. Double-edged meaning, you know, good and bad. It's a kind of sword that you can fight with, but that can also stab you. So globalization has created massive wealth, but part of how it's done so is through unequal relationships and unfair relationships. So this is seen in the fact that, and it's a quite stark number, and these numbers are a little bit dated, so it may be even more extreme now, but that thinking that the world's richest 85 individuals have more income than the poorest 3.4 billion people combined. So think of that. Think of, again, think of 85 people having more income than 3.4 billion people. That's massive. So sociologically, we ask, how could that come about? How could it be that there are such people that, I mean, it's like beyond any conception of elite. You think they have, you know, that means each person has like tens of millions of times more money than other people. So how does that happen? So International Labor Organization, ILO, has tracked data on who earns what and where. And so these numbers put in perspective, again, in terms of absolute poverty, we see that almost 400 million workers in 2013 earned less than $1.25 US a day. And there's close to 1 billion people, so 840 million, about 28% of all workers earn less than $2 a day. And I mean, goods cost different amounts in different countries, but in most countries this would constitute, if not relative poverty, absolute poverty. 5 out of 10, so half of 10 people are in vulnerable employment situations. So in my dissertation, I looked at people like that, although relatively privileged by being in Canada and having, you know, earning above minimum wage. But vulnerable employment situations are ones where you could be terminated at any time. You're working contract to contract, and you're, again, at risk of falling into absolute poverty. And 5 out of 10 workers live in poverty, either absolute or relative. So basically this is saying half of individual workers around the world are at risk of being in relative or absolute poverty. So either living below national standards or not being able to put food on the table or have a table at all. So again, these are pretty extreme numbers. Now the GDP, as I discussed before, it's an abstract concept, so I did some extra hunting myself just to find an easier way to explain it. And again, I think the easiest way to explain it is to see the GDP is each person's share of the country's economic activity. So as we'll see, countries are hierarchically organized in a linear way based on like which country has the highest economic activity, which is seen as the wealthiest, like it produces the most, it has the highest paying jobs, the most jobs, all of that, versus ones that have the least amount of economic activity. And these are used as a measure of wealth because typically a country that has a lot of economic activity, that means you probably have a lot more rich individuals, people that are enjoying and consuming a lot of things in life. So here, this says, using 2015 data, in the US, the average GDP per person, so if you were to so this is simply done by dividing the working population, so adults over age 18, different countries, they might set that differently as time goes on, but basically dividing the working population, dividing the gross national product, so all of the economic activity, all of the money circulating, dividing that by the number of working population. So when you do that in the US, you have an average GDP, so the average worker's contribution to the big national number. Here it's 55,800. In Canada, it's just over 43,000, so ours is a bit lower. And then in countries such as Sao Tome and Principe, it's 3,700. So that's an example of one that's like 15 times less than America and over 10 times less than Canada. So just again, to put those numbers in perspective. So here in this chart, this chart's from your textbook and it has some numbers above the highest 10. Ignore those. Those are like averages of countries. The important numbers here, I think, are just looking at the top 10 and bottom 10 of the highest GDP. And again, just thinking in terms of the global north and global south, these numbers, the differences might be shocking, but if you think of the processes behind this, they might not be that as surprising. And it's very important here too, you'll see that certain countries, you may think, oh, I'm surprised that they're in the top 10, but if you compare the national to the per person, then it makes sense of that. So, for example, America, as we've seen, has the highest personal GDP, and it also has the highest national GDP. So that means they have a lot of people earning relatively a lot of money, or making a lot of money. Compare that with the case of China. So what's the biggest difference between America and China? Which categories would you say, which one relatively is more of a difference with the states? The personal or the national? Personal, right? So here China has about half of the GDP, but the personal GDP is like a seventh or an eighth. So what does that mean? Yep. Exactly, right. So here that means there's much more inequality, right? So let's say 11 million, this is huge amounts of money, right? That's 11 trillion, I believe. I'm not a math major, but remember those are in millions. So it's like 11 million or whatever. So it's a lot of money being produced, and yet per person it's only 7,000. The GDP per person. So that means there's certain individuals producing that than others. Then compare that with Japan. It only has one of 4 million, yet its number is about 5 times higher than China's per person. So again, we see these differences of what the average is versus what the country's making. The point here, though, is, again, there's 2 levels, and you have to analyze both to make sense of what's going on the ground. So a country can have a very high national GDP, but it's divided among workers differently. So the key issue here too is also the population, right? That's the number one. So there's more inequality, but also population. Because again, I remember I told you, it's a bit tricky. This is just looking at all working adults. So China's number is lower because it has more people also, right? So the individual, same with India, right? India is much, much lower, and that's because there's more people that it's dividing across. The inequality itself in China and America, it may not be that different. It is the case that there are many wealthy Americans and many Chinese individuals, but also, as we know, there are many parts of China, when you think of sweatshops and things, that on paper individuals are making very little money. So again, the 3 factors to think of when you're looking at GDP: what's the country's national GDP, and then is that GDP high because they have a really high population? So it could have like a trillion GDP, but does it have billions of people? And if you divide it, then you see each person isn't making much. And then level 3 is who in that country is contributing to that average. Do you have people that are mega rich, earning millions a year, like many people of that class, like you have in America, and many in China, or is it more equally distributed, like somewhere like Norway? So here, this is just to put it in perspective. So the highest 10 GDP, again, just look at the top. You have 18 million, and then making roughly 59,000 per person. But then in the lowest, at number 195, you have a national GDP of 38 million only, so exponentially less, and a per person GDP that they don't even have enough data to calculate. And the one above that is only $1,000. So we see major discrepancies, again, both in terms of the national GDP, what's made, and in terms of what individuals make. And then we're not getting, there's only so much we can cover in this class. We're not getting so much into the 99%, 1%, but we discussed that a bit when we were looking at how 85 people in the world have as much income as 3.4 billion. So again, the next level of analysis is to look within the country and say, okay, the average in America is 60,000, but does that mean that everyone in America is making close to 60,000? No, it doesn't. Some people are making way higher, and many others are making much less. So I just want to make sure I wasn't confusing you with the example of that. So, because again, it's dividing all the number of the population. So the higher the population, the more that number is being divided. So for example, if Canada and America somehow had the same gross domestic national product, Canada's per person income, GDP, would be way higher because our population is so much smaller. So. Okay, so all of this stuff we've presented so far has the implication of thinking about foreign aid. And this is another huge hot button issue politically right now too, across many different countries. The question of foreign aid is, to what extent should a country be responsible for the well-being of other countries? That's a much more kind of utilitarian way of framing a question that's often asked much more nicely. The nicer way of asking that is, to what extent should people give to other countries and help other countries in need? But oftentimes when you're talking about it politically, you have to say, okay, well what we're doing is we're claiming some sort of responsibility for other nations. So here, much of the story of how this has happened is that the global north tends to provide financial aid to support the global south to promote economic development. So the development of infrastructure. So many countries are given foreign aid, both in ways to kind of repair damages that have been done through colonial intervention, but also just to increase these countries' kind of partnership in a new global world. So, if you view the world optimistically, you think no one really wants to see people starving or even living in relative poverty by their own country standards around the world. So the United Nations is kind of the key global institution or organization that people usually think of when they think of how are these funds allocated, how do countries become indebted to one another, are these gifts versus are these loans versus are these reparations. So in 1970, the UN resolved that development aid should equal 0.7% of the gross national income. So gross national income is a bit different than gross domestic product. Again, GDP, it's harder to calculate, but it's not a person's income, it's their economic activity, which is calculated by economists in a bit more complicated way. The GNI is, again, what's the income of all individuals and corporations. So 0.7% may not seem like a lot, but in a country, say like America, where that's a lot of money, depending on the year, but you're talking billions and billions of dollars. So the UN said 0.7% should go to foreign aid, and some countries exceed that, but typically they don't, and most do not meet that. So by 2016, only 6 countries met the target. So the UK, Luxembourg, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and the Netherlands. And so if you see a trend here in many of these countries, particularly Sweden, Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, these are countries themselves that are highly egalitarian and they have very strong social welfare policies. So it kind of makes sense that they would be leading that pack. Both Canada and the US, I'm not sure of the exact numbers right now, but historically they've fallen well short of this target. And again, that's because Canada and America are marked by high levels of income inequality. Just for example, in Canada, much of the aid that could go to foreign aid is around solving the inequality we already have, and the same with America. So often it's difficult to deal with both issues at the same time, but also there's an issue, again, of claiming responsibility. That's why I said that's important. Countries vary in terms of how much they think or their leaders at the time believe that they play a role in the relative poverty of other countries. And again, that's where, again, you're seeing that, not to keep using America as an example, but obviously American politics are very big right now, but that's a huge issue right now in terms of the two major political parties, their stance on both taking in immigrants and refugees, and then their stance on giving foreign aid to other countries, to what extent they should do that. So just nearing the end of all of this theoretical approaches, so just a brief overview before we get in. We'll have modernization theory, dependency theory, and then our nice kind of little symbolic interactionist theory of symbolic interactionism, or sorry, of world systems theory. So again, kind of the first theory we'll be discussing can be seen as more functionalist, the second one is conflict, and the third is symbolic interactionist. So I think it's just a nice way to wrap up these ideas. And these are all pretty self-explanatory, I think. So modernization theory is essentially the idea that technological process will lead to economic development, and that modernization in turn is great. It's good for the economy, it's good for growth more generally. And so this idea, or this theory, frames globalization as a kind of positive natural consequence of first world or globally north countries becoming increasingly developed. Here it's almost a process of socialization or imitation, where countries in the global south or quote-unquote second or third world countries imitate those in the first world in the global south. They see, oh, these countries are building these technologies, they're spending their time this way, they're secularizing, we should do that too. The process of modernization is seen as inevitable, irreversible, and linear. So remember that big Enlightenment moment. In the Enlightenment, that's when people were casting off things like castes and feudal ownership, and they were saying, we are all people and we have rationality, and we can build industry, we can build factories and cars, and we can have higher gender equality, whatever the case is. Gender equality came later, but many women were starting to be very involved through like rational argument and on paper. And so this moment, again, was saying we need progress, and progress is marked by economic gain, technology, and kind of the reduced power of tradition and religion. So this led ultimately, according to this theory, to the dominant view, again, that countries becoming more modernized, more high-tech, less religious, less tradition-based, that is a natural process and it will keep going forward. So this view promotes the use of foreign capital, not as charity. So foreign aid here is not about even charity or repairs. So it's not about someone with a big heart giving money to another country, or about someone making up for prior injustices, but it's saying, you know what? Every country should modernize because that will benefit every other country. So that's really where the functionalism in this comes in. It's saying, well, modernity and modernization is a natural process. Once you have a certain kind of technology, you'll then become part of this race. And this leads to globalization. So the theory extends and says, well, if we help other countries enter this race, often through loans, so from like the World Bank and the IMF, not only will we make money off the loans, but then we'll have more trading partners. And we can have other people specializing in technologies, and then this will just keep boosting everyone up. So again, I said globalization is often viewed more positively, optimistically, more negatively, critically. Again, negative doesn't mean bad, but it's more, functionalist versus conflict theory, the perspective you're taking. So this approach, it says, no, like Western history was good. People are liberated. We earn more money. So we should lend money and we should spread Western values. So this view tends to be Eurocentric and ethnocentric. Again, and it's kind of saying, well, the West has done really well historically. We're not going to focus very much on exploitation or anything like that, but we're just going to focus on, the GDP going up, America being #1, and then we can spread that around the world. And so again, it's important to see that for many people, that's their like genuine theoretical lens. They're not necessarily trying to mask what they're doing, but they do believe that. Again, some people may be using that as an excuse, other people may believe it more, but this is a perspective you'll see very often, again, if you follow politics around global trade and globalization. So again, that fits the more functionalist view. And again, at this point of the course, I'm trying to show you that this isn't even just like looking at functionalism and conflict theory in particular. Even though these are the terms we use in sociology, these are not limited just to sociology. I mean, again, think of people's perspectives on issues, think of government's issues. These are views held and endorsed by people in the real world. So, not that sociologists aren't in the real world, but I mean by even people that aren't particularly academic. So then dependency theory is the opposite. So modernization theory, this big functionalist outgrowth. Remember, globalization sees different societies as integrated and interdependent, very Durkheimian. Now, dependency theory questions the extent to which this integration and interdependence is actually neutral, or whether it's much more top-down. And whether it's top-down or not, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. So again, here the focus is on development, and here seeing underdevelopment of many countries that were grounded in the creation of poverty, histories of exploitation, and destructive colonial forces. So again, the narrative in modernization theory is that the first world countries are bringing up other countries, right? It's like a rising tide lifts all boats, or whatever the saying is. Dependency theory says no, actually, historically, many countries have been pushed into the second and third world through wars and through appropriation of their lands, destruction of their customs and cultures and infrastructures. We've erased all of that destruction, and now we just say, oh, we're bringing them up to their level. We're lending them money. We're giving them money. So here, the argument for dependency theory, again, borrowing from or a manifestation of conflict theory, says far from just bringing up these abstract countries that were lagging behind, Western countries contributed to the process of these countries having both absolute and relative poverty at higher levels than Western countries. And in fact, they've made them dependent on the aid of these countries. So here, an example is just thinking of indigenous populations in Canada, and think of how we discussed residential schools and how these populations had, robust and good ways of ways of living and communicating with nature and valuing the state and all sorts of things, and how those were ruptured by European colonizers. So this is very much using that same logic of saying, okay, maybe if we look at different countries, maybe some countries are being modernized in a way that their indigenous values are being used, are being built on, but there are many countries where they have been exploited, and this story is much more one of colonialism. So again, rather than make big claims, big grand theoretical claims of saying every country is being brought into modernity nicely, say to what extent is that actually happening? Is this country being exploited? What was the impact of colonization? Who is winning from this? Are they being put in a relation of dependence? Again, so how do you analyze any specific country as opposed to making big statements? Now, this idea of specifying the impact of Western intervention or a country's intervention in the well-being of another country, this leads now to the most dominant theory that's used in sociology and political science for analyzing inequality and globalization. So this is world systems theory. So rather than see, because again, conflict theory, it has the tendency to be too critical sometimes. And make generalizations, it's not that it's too critical, it's that it tends to make big generalizations sometimes. So world systems theory says rather than see these countries as having no agency and just being dependent on quote unquote first world or global north countries, this investigates the combination of economic and political hierarchy that different countries have and that connect them as part of a system. So this creates a few new terms around the idea of a periphery. So here, rather than really having even global north and global south countries, world systems theorists still accept those terms, but they say the most interesting thing is to see if you're looking at globalization, what does globalization really mean? It means that we've shifted from having a bunch of different countries and states to now having like one country, one world that has been divided into kind of somewhat arbitrary state borders. So now it says if you're looking at it as an organism, then you have core countries, periphery countries, and semi-periphery. So the core would be like the global north, usually. The periphery would be those second world or some of the global north, and the periphery would be the global south or the third world. So what this does is, rather than lump, so it's one step kind of more micro and more nuanced and more flexible than global north and global south is versus first world, second world, third world. This is now saying, okay, the global market we've developed, the key commonality is that it's based on capitalist principles. Which countries have been core in this process and have the highest stakes in this? And how do other countries, like think of it as an onion, right? Which ones are closest to the center, and which ones are more struggling to get into that center? And not even struggling necessarily, but just that's typically a way to see it, because those are the countries that will have the highest levels of absolute and relative poverty. So what this does is this shifts away from dependency and then just says, okay, if I'm looking at any country, how economically well off are they, and how is that related to their histories, again, of colonialism, their history of capitalism, their religious history, all of that. So, and seeing, these titles or these theory names are very self-evident. This is seeing the world as one integrated system, but that different countries are located in different parts of it. Some are closer to the heart and have a bigger stake than others that have been either newly brought in like a nice way, or ones that have kind of like violently been colonized and forced into it. So again, the three theories, like every other time we talk about functionalist conflict and symbolic interactionism, the three stories are A, in functionalism, it's more a natural process that is overall beneficial. Dependency theory says, well, it's become a process that seems natural, but it's very much divided. And then symbolic interactionism, bringing in world systems theory, saying, okay, let's not focus so much on either function or conflict, but let's just say, okay, now we have a global market. To what extent are countries participating in this? And then you can get into the history after that. Again, though, so it's not as simple. People very much do still use modernization theory and dependency theory. So I'm always presenting it as like, oh, symbolic interaction comes in, and then that's just what we're using. Most people are using that, but those other theories still exist and are still used. So just as today's study buddy activity, before we end off, I'd like you to compare and contrast modernization, dependency, and world systems theories of globalization. So I know you've done the Revel quizzes and you've thought about this. So for you and your study buddies, which theory is most compelling and which is least compelling? And again, we all have different stories because, especially in a global class like this, we have different ideas of immigration and economic inequality. And this is a space where you can talk about those things as sociologists. So with your study buddies, I'd just like you to think, which theory resonates with you and why? So talk with your study buddies. Any thoughts they'd like to share on what their group of lifelong study buddies came up with? So which theory do you think is most compelling? Yep.
I'd say dependency theory because historically speaking, colonialism did happen, and then the current system, like the diplomacies and like how world countries are treating each other, it's not like it's really hierarchical in a way. It's fatalistic because like certain countries are forced, for example, to practice like monocrop, right? So that they can sell that kind of stuff and like export it to like core countries like United States and all those like global North countries. So that's like a systematic thing, right? So yeah, it's not very meritocratic. So that really hinders them from really like developing initially.
So we have one for dependency theory. So again, the idea is based on kind of the pressures from global north countries on global south countries to produce certain kinds of goods for them. Remember, one of the basic ideas behind globalization was, again, the demand for exotic goods. So kind of saying that history linked to colonization of why certain natural areas would be exploited or cultural areas would be exploited, again, feeds into this kind of top-down hierarchical, almost feudalism idea. Okay, so again, there's no right and wrong answer. It all depends on what your perspective is and how you're analyzing the topic. As you'll learn, the more you go through university, most topics you'll be asked to think about, there's no right or wrong. There could be ones that are more right and more wrong based on like the current paradigm and what people tend to think. But it's always about how you justify your argument. So if you're going to make a case for any of these theories, you're not writing essays in this class, but going forward, it's about what evidence are you rallying. So again, for you, it was the idea of certain commodities and that pressure, and that sounds like a reasonable argument to me. You could make arguments for other theories using different arguments as well. Okay. World systems theory, again, I always kind of end with the symbolic interactionism because that's usually what people have settled on, is if you had to pick like the overall best theory, usually that's what people tend to pick, because symbolic interactionist approaches tend to capture both sides or from a more neutral way. But again, sociology, unlike many other disciplines, our theories are all debated and alive, and that's what makes it fun to keep learning, because again, as social life keeps moving on, we're increasingly trying to figure out what makes us tick, and what would a perfect society look like, and why did this fail, and why is this succeeding. So again, all of these things are alive and up for grabs. So just to end this week's lecture, so to tie it back to the Mass Media Week, you'll see a similar term. So you should recognize the idea of homogenization of culture. So as discussed there, as the world becomes increasingly dominated by Western mass media, so things like YouTube, Facebook, yes, people can put on their own content, but these are things made in the West. Those are more open than historically global dominated Western media has been. So like shows from American television networks, American news, British news, things like that. But they still tend to be largely Western dominated. So Hollywood films, books, the list goes on. But so the homogenization of culture is the idea that we're either critical or not critical of this process. So it's asking, to what extent is the kind of global saturation, so remember in social change, social movements, when a change happens and it just becomes embedded and hegemonic in a way, so I'm trying to build all these concepts together, you're seeing everything is coming together. To what extent is the saturation of Western media good? Well, one thing that's good is that we can see more of the world and we can see how others live. So globalization and the homogenization of cultures means, there's increasingly people are becoming more similar. We're like English as a universal language. We're connecting more. But culture is no longer tied to cities or towns, but you have these global cultures, like you have gamers around the world that can communicate, cosplayers, you have sociologists around the world that are part of a intellectual community, like I can present in conferences around the world, and we basically speak the same language because we know the same terms, the same concepts, we're probably interested about the same issues. And some cultures become indigenized. So they incorporate new cultural values and messages into the local culture. So indigenization is the process of again saying, well, and it's very different from homogenization. So again, homogenization is all the cultures are becoming the same. Indigenization is saying, no, well, we're selectively taking in some of the global culture. So for example, let's say so for video games, so Japanese video games, like Tekken, the one I played, that's huge around the world. The two scenes that I know are the most competitive, aside from Japan, are the United States and South Korea. And so indigenization there would be the way that these video games are played are quite different in the United States and in South Korea. So they're played in different gaming venues, they're played at different times, they cost different amounts of money, the statuses around them are very different, they're higher status in South Korea because it's more linked to other things that are valued. So that's a more positive view. But again, the critique of globalization is that cultures could become homogenous, and homogenous around dominant global values, which in our current moment are dominant Western values. So the hope is, again, we're always alternating between optimism and pessimism and more increasing equality versus increasing inequality. The hope is moving towards what's called hybrid cultures and cosmopolitanism. So cosmopolitanism, Toronto is often seen as a major cosmopolitan city. Again, as opposed to being a melting pot, we have many different cultures, and the multicultural tradition of Toronto and Canada more broadly, at least idealistically, is that all of these cultures can flourish here. We don't really have one staple culture, and we're very open. So cosmopolitanism is seeing culture as fluid, which prevents cultural homogenization. So here, Canada's open to immigration, partly because it wants to help other countries, partly because it wants to make repairs, but also partly because it wants to keep the culture alive and rich and diverse, and not let it go stagnant, not that we all become a bunch of YouTubers or a bunch of factory workers or a bunch of whatever the culture becomes, but learning from other places and constantly indigenizing ourselves. Again, meaning we're a local culture taking on everything around us and evolving. So just some questions to think about going forward, and then I'll just have a couple fun little things before we go. So explain what differentiates the global north from the global south. Again, think of the technological, economic, and political histories of countries. Think of who's on the top 10 list of the GDP, who's on the bottom, and then looking at those top 10 ones, you see countries that are actually part of the global south there, like India, and look there and say, well, they have a high GDP, but they have tons of people, so each person's earning a lot less. Or in other countries, maybe like America, they're number one, they are part of the global north, but just because they're part of the global north doesn't mean they don't have major amounts of inequality. And then describe some of the issues surrounding foreign aid. What are the pros and cons? Remember, we haven't got so much into this, but many people are critical of foreign aid, not just because, they're economically or socially conservative and they don't want to give money to other countries, but many people view foreign aid almost as another form of colonization, because many times the money that's given comes with strings attached. So it's like, we'll give you money if you build this. We'll give you money if you pay this back in this way. Aid is very infrequently just given neutrally. It often involves certain assumptions of development, and then the question becomes, is it worth taking this money for what it might do to the country in the long term? So then ultimately, again, one of these unresolvable questions, but that people have opinions on, what should Canada's role be in foreign aid? Again, and these questions, the reason they remain unresolved is because you think, again, any money that you're giving internationally is money that you're not giving to people domestically. So how are you going to get people, like the people that vote for these bills are domestic. So then how do you convince people domestically that it's actually in their interest, as like a human global citizen, to give a proportion of their money abroad, right? So most people are willing to do that to some extent, but again, it's walking on eggshells sometimes to convince people or persuade people to do that. So I will post the Undergrad Research Day again, Tuesday, April 9th. Please register if you haven't already. And then I'm just going to show you, so I'm going to make a new Mentimeter poll for you, because I want to know what you think, as always. So just give me 1 second. While I do my little secrets up here, and you can be chatting with your study buddies and stuff before you go. Oops. And so I have a few questions, just because, I want to do some, we're having those review sessions, which are going to be very much like the ones you already had. Oops, what is that? But I want to know also what would be useful for you guys next lecture. So in terms of that. So now today it's March 24th poll. So I'm going to do a short little poll and show you something fun. Well, hopefully that you find fun. Okay. Okay. Okay, so I think I told you guys that I'm, so I'm keeping it a surprise for now. So before you answer this, so you can answer this now, but I'm going to show you something fun. So I think we remember our work and political economy week. So I think I told you work is my area of study. So I made a fun video, both for you guys, double, so I'm double booking. So I made a video, so just show of hands, because I know this is going to work even better for you than for my other class. So I'm teaching a class on the sociology of work, the social psychology of work, downtown. And so I made a video, actually, to kind of funnily help them for their final test. But I can make one like that for you guys on a different topic. But this one actually fits the work and political economy week. So just show of hands, those of you that studied Hamlet in grade 12. Probably almost everyone, right? So are you familiar with to be or not to be and the big soliloquy, and you know what all that's about? Okay, so the last week of my social psych class, just to whet your appetites about the kind of classes I teach, the last week is called to be employed or not to be employed. So given all the good and bad things, you know, you can see I always do that in every class, because I don't love arguing, but I just love, you know, showing people multiple sides of things. So I have a video on that I made. So upping my performance again. You get to see me, I'm not wearing anything funny, but that's just me in my office up here. Because no one comes to my office hours, so I just sit there doing these things, apparently. Oops. Let me just see the volume. Hopefully it works. That would be sad if it didn't. Perfect. Oh, see, I'm being cyberbullied. Someone just logged in. I just made it visible right now. Someone just logged in. I literally just made it visible 5 minutes ago. Someone logged in and disliked it. Cyberbullying. Anyway, it's okay.
That is the question. Whether it is no longer in our mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous career fortune, or to take resume in hand against a sea of demanding employers, and by applying, obtain thy tasks, to work, to get paid, no more than by retiring to say the end to the disappointment and the thousand rejection letters that the job hunter is destined to. 'Tis a consummation of value to be wished, to retire, to not work, to retire, perchance to dream. There's the rub. For in that sleep of retirement, what dreams may come, when we have shuffled off this bourgeois coil, must give us pause. There's a respect that calamity makes
I don't know why that's happening.
a career. For who would bear the whips and scorns of work? The boss's wrong, proud workers' bravado, the pangs of despised daily tasks, the payday's delay, the insolence of the office, and the spurns that patient merit the careerist takes when he himself lays quietest mate with any simple job. Who would burdens bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after work, in undiscovered country, from whose bourne no traveler returns, puzzles the will and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly at others that we know not. Thus conscience does make cowards of us all, unless the native hue of resolution is sickly and over, with the pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pitch and moment, with disregard the currents from awry and lose the name of vocation. Be understanding of me, fair employer. Lawrence, in my final test next week from 12 p.m. to 2 p.m. in class, be all my sins ribbon.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Dislike her. I knew it. You know what? Did you see that part of the, I'll just show you. Maybe they're doing it because of this. I didn't show you this part.
Hi.
Ooh, oh my God. Oh my God. Oh my God. Okay, sorry about that. Because I made this, maybe they're making fun of me because of this joke I made. Huh? Got my first thumb, feels Batman. Get it? Feels Batman? Feels Batman, my first dislike. Huh? Humor? Anyway, so I made myself a little Batman. So she already answered this. Okay, so what do you want for next lecture? So let me see. Give extra points, do a Kahoot. Kahoot, okay, people want that. Someone asked for that in the other lecture. End our lecture 30 minutes earlier. To have more time, Kahoot. Okay. Narcissistic game show thing, please bring food. Okay, people want Kahoot. Wow, everyone, okay. So I'll figure out how to do that. So in Kahoot, so like what would the idea be? Like, so a Kahoot of what? So how does that work? Because I know because this stuff isn't competitive, like it's anonymous. So what would the idea in a Kahoot be? Like a game show where people win or, yeah.
It's like the Rebel quiz, but everybody in the class competes against each other.
Okay.
There's like first place, second place.
And then it says who. It says
Oh, okay. So it's like in Cineplex when they have those games.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, because I knew how it worked. I didn't know the scoring. Okay. So then that way. Okay. So then I can give prizes based on the scores. Okay, that makes sense. So I'll do that. That makes sense. Okay, that'll be fun. Okay, extra point on final. Okay. Well, I'm gonna have more. As you noticed, last time I had 2 questions as extra. And so I'm going to have an extra one, but actually worth an extra point this time. So it'll probably be worth 1 point on the final. So that'll be more. Yeah, so okay, so that'll be fun. So I want to try to make some game like the other one that'll also double as like a study session. So that's, because I'm going to do the study session anyway, so I might as well turn it into a game. Okay, so for this, what kind of video do you want to see? So I told you I want to make a couple more. So I'm going to make, this could be either one you want to see or one you want the format to be for the final review video. So I am going to do one. I've said I've been writing summaries, like partly what the textbook says and partly what I'm thinking about it. Summaries of each chapter and making one video about it. Like I don't want to give you 20 videos because it'll take too long. Everything important, gaming video. Depends, I'm hungry right now. Oh, like the St. Patrick's Day video. That was funny. Overview of main theories. Yeah, no, the summaries will be lighter. It's more like the summaries, because I'm trying to think. I don't want it to be redundant of the textbook or my lectures. It's more framing of like what's important, what was the central message. Just so you can listen to it and then think of what's there. Okay. And just for my own formative feedback, what do you think of today's video? So the video, for some reason it messes up when I show the ones of just me. It's giving me a sign that I shouldn't be recording myself, I guess. But it's only on these screens for some reason, this one in the other room. The video itself, if you look at it on YouTube, shouldn't be bad. But I'm going to refresh the page to see if I got more dislikes. Oh, so you guys are so nice. You made up for the dislike. Lawrence is like, oh, oops, oh, I'm not signed in. Someone signed into my account once from the other lecture. See, the Monday lecture, they're going to hear this, but someone signed into my lecture from the other room once. They signed into my Facebook, and they posted on my wall. I was like, thank God they didn't say anything bad. So it was probably a nice student. I don't know. Well, what kind of student would do that anyway? But someone, because I log into these things through my Facebook, and I didn't do it incognito, and then someone wrote like, it sounded like very traumatic, and I thought, like, my friends, some of them messaged me and they were like, are you okay? Because it said something like, even in memories I will be there, or whatever. And I'm like, what the hell? And I'm like, thank God no one called the cops on me. Or maybe not, maybe they don't care, but I don't know. But anyways, so that's why I didn't, what's it called? That's why now I sign in from here, just because the last thing I need is that. But I'll show you live, see? I'm a good. View reply. Huh? Right? See? Positive affirmation, right? No cyberbullying from this one. Okay. Love it. Gaming content. So I have more secret gaming content ones. To pass this course or not to pass this course? Yes, exactly. PewDiePie. Other videos. More costumes, yeah. Okay. So I'm going to do, okay, so for the, yeah, I'm going to try to do the, so I have some videos here too that are helpful for the test that people haven't really been watching. So if you, I have one on because I kind of glossed it over, but one that could be useful for people is the Sociological Research and Methods one. So I'll make a note in the next video that I make. But so that one, I think, and the Marx, Durkheim, Weber, and the classical, and the contemporary. The contemporary one, again, I said this one I made more in mind for the final. So, like, it's not a proper video, but if you just like pause it, I have a whole bunch of summaries. So those are useful. So I would look at those first for now while you're studying. These are just me, I'm writing, trying to. You see, and bell hooks, just like my character, right? So, but just, these are me explaining them in my own words. So I think that's helpful. But okay, so for next lecture, I can't believe we only have one left. So, I know that people are plugged into Facebook and everything. Try to tell your dispersed study buddies, so the people that aren't here today, tell them to come next week, or don't, because the less people that come, the more odds that you'll win awesome swag, Sociology 03 swag. But, I'm going to have fun things. I already have the tickets, so I have the idea. So I went to, what's it called? When my partner had his birthday party, we went to a party supply store, and I bought beer tickets. So the winners will get beer tickets, which then they can exchange. So it's kind of wasteful. It doesn't make sense. But the winners will get beer tickets, which then you can exchange with me for something. So just so it feels more legit. They're like fun pink little beer tickets. So you'll exchange those with prizes. Okay, wait, sorry. So one more question then. I might as well keep sourcing this out to ask you guys. Because I never know. I'm not, as much as I'm lit, I don't know what people really like. Sorry, first this up. So what prizes do you want? So I don't know, because I have like snacks and stuff are easy, so I don't know what people like. I could do books, I could do all sorts of things. But I don't want to seem like I'm forcing you to read more than you have to. Like, I don't know what's fun. 4.0, marks, grades. Okay. Yeah, I might do the in class. So I remember I still owe you guys marks from the other one. So I still have the notes of that. The extra marks, I guess, because I would just feel so bad giving for the people that just don't make it. So I think the extra marks I might do. I'm going to do that for everyone. Yep.
So also, you announced that I completed a survey, I believe, from the third, I submitted, but I'm not sure we are getting marks from that.
Yeah, so the survey person, they're going to add the grades for us. So Soli Dubash, he'll add all that stuff for us. GPA boost. Well, we'll see, you know. Again, final grades aren't in. Things can happen. Gift card? Yeah. A hug or a gift card. All right. Okay, good. So I hope that everyone has a great second last week. I was talking to one of the students in the front about Undergrad Research Day. I strongly recommend you'll go there. You go there. So I will be there too. And again, if you miss me, it's right after the last lecture. It's the week after. I'll probably hold office hours that day since I'll be here anyway. I don't live in Scarborough, but so when I come down here, I like to do extra stuff. So I'll probably hold it that afternoon. But for now, have a great week. Next, there's no tutorials this week because you had them last week. But there's a lot of stuff coming up again. I will make the announcement, but we will have those review sessions led by Ujwal, Sarah, and Andrew starting this Wednesday, 2 p.m., 5 p.m. 2 p.m. to 5 p.m., then before lecture on Monday, then next Wednesday, same thing, so you don't have to go to all of them, but HL 459. And then next week, we have our final exam review tutorials, and then that's it. So we just have the exam left at this point, and one tutorial and the exam. So we're really getting to the end.
What was assignment 3 out of 70 and not 100?